The Black Forest in Germany is home to many legends and strange events. But one photographer claims to have witnessed a werewolf-like creature during a hike there. I've got that story for you today, and more, in this episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails, and you should check out my card game where you battle cryptids. Just go to CryptidCardGame.com. Enjoy today's stories, and send me your terrifying true tales at darkstories.org. Now, let's begin. Black Forest Werewolf from Hindenburg. I have lived in Freiburg, Germany for most of my life. It's a beautiful city, right on the edge of the Black Forest. Growing up, naturally, I heard all the old stories about that forest. Tales of mischievous dwarfs, mysterious glassmakers, spirits that roamed the woods. But to me, they were always just stories. At least until I had my own experience. I work as a freelance photographer, mostly doing nature shots for travel magazines and the like. Honestly, it's a dream job. I get to spend my days hiking through some of the most beautiful landscapes in Europe, camera in hand. The Black Forest has always been one of my favorite spots. There's something about the dense, dark trees and the mist that often clings to the ground. It's atmospheric. To me, the eeriness can be relaxing. I had a commission from a hiking magazine to get some shots of the less traveled paths in the forest. They wanted to do a feature on hidden gems for experienced hikers. I was thrilled. This was a chance to explore some areas I hadn't been to before. My usual hiking partner, Marcus, couldn't make it at the last minute. "Sorry, mate," he said over the phone. "My kid's got the flu. You gonna be okay on your own?" I assured him I'd be fine. It's just a couple of nights. I'll stick to the plan and check in when I can. I set out early on a Tuesday morning in late October. There was a light fog hanging over the city as I drove towards the forest. I'd planned a 3-day trip, staying at some of the more remote mountain huts along the trail. The first day went smoothly. I hiked about 20 kilometers, following one of the lesser-known trails. The autumn colors were stunning, deep reds and golds of the beech trees, contrasting beautifully with the dark green of the spruces and firs. I even got some great shots of the Bergbach waterfall. It was roaring from the recent rains. As evening approached, I made it to the first hut. The place was basic but comfortable enough. It had a few bunk beds, a small kitchen area, and most importantly, a roof over my head. The forecast had mentioned possible showers, and I could hear the wind picking up outside. But then I heard something else. A long, low howl echoing through the trees. I know what you might be thinking. Wolves, right? And yeah, I know they've been making a comeback in Germany. But in all my years hiking the Black Forest, I'd never heard one. It sent a shiver down my spine. I tried to shrug it off. Maybe it was just the wind. Or maybe I was lucky enough to finally hear one of the newly returned wolves. But as I sat there, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I heard it again. It was closer this time. I'm not ashamed to admit I was a bit creeped out. I've spent plenty of nights alone in the woods, but something about this felt different. Something about it felt wrong. I made sure the hut door was securely locked, and I tried to get some sleep, but every little sound put me further on edge. I must have dozed off eventually, because the next thing I knew, it was dawn. The forest was quiet except for the usual morning bird calls. I felt a bit foolish in the light of day. I probably just let my imagination run wild last night. I packed up and set off, determined to get some good shots. The path I was following was barely visible at times, all overgrown and rarely used. It was exactly what the magazine was asking for, though. As the day wore on, I began to feel this watched feeling, That feeling you get when the hairs on your arms stand up and you just know someone is out there looking at you. It was that, but intense. Every time I turned around, there would be nothing there. I tried to focus on my work, but I kept finding myself glancing over my shoulder. The forest seemed darker somehow, the shadows deeper than they should have been. At one point, I could have sworn I saw something move just at the edge of my vision, but when I turned to look, once again, there was nothing there. By late afternoon, I was seriously considering cutting my trip short. The feeling of being watched only grew worse, and now I was beginning to hear things. The snapping of twigs, leaves rustling about, always just out of sight. I checked my phone, hoping to call Marcus, or maybe even the local Bergwacht, but of course, no signal. Just my luck. I pushed on to the next hut, arriving just as it was getting dark. This one was even more isolated than the first, and as I approached, I heard a splash from a nearby stream. What I saw then, I still have trouble believing it, even now. Standing in the stream not 20 meters away from me was something. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall, muscular, standing on two legs. But as I stared, unable to move, I realized it wasn't human at all. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was elongated, almost like a wolf's snout, with teeth that looked wickedly sharp, even from where I stood. Its eyes were amber, glowing in the fading light, and they were fixed right on me. For a moment, neither of us moved. I couldn't even breathe. Then slowly, deliberately, it lifted its head and let out that same howl I'd heard the night before. I ran. I'd like to say I was brave, that I stood my ground or tried to document what I saw. But the truth is, blind panic took over. I just ran, leaving my backpack behind. I stumbled through the woods, tripping over roots and rocks, my lungs beginning to burn. I'm not sure if it was fear in my mind causing me to hear it, but I thought I could hear it behind me. These heavy footfalls, snapping branches. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually, I broke out of the tree line onto one of the main hiking paths. There were a few other hikers there, looking at me like I was crazy. I'm sure I looked that way. "Whoa, are you all right?" one of them asked. He was a big guy who looked like a serious outdoorsman. I babbled something about a wolf, pointing back the way I'd come from. The hiker looked at his buddy, and the buddy looked back. "A wolf? Here?" his friend said, looking skeptical. "I mean, maybe a dog. There's a village not far from..." Eventually, I talked them into checking it out, probably more to humor me than anything else. They came back a few minutes later, shaking their heads. "Nothing there, friend," the first guy said. "You sure you're okay? Do you need us to call someone?" I must have looked a real mess. They kept insisting on giving me a ride back to Freiburg. I think they assumed I'd had some kind of panic attack. This overworked city guy not used to the forest. That sort of thing. I didn't correct them, though, but I didn't know what else to say. It took me a few days to work up the courage to go back for my gear. This time I took Marcus with me when he was free, and I went in broad daylight. We found my backpack right where I dropped it. No tracks, though. No sign that anything else had been there. "You sure you didn't spook yourself, mate?" Marcus asked me as we hiked back. "You know how creepy it is out here, especially when you're alone." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. "I still live here in Freiburg. I still work as a photographer, but I've learned my lesson about the Black Forest. I won't go back out there alone. And even in the middle of the city, I keep my doors and windows locked up tight." To this day, I doubt what I saw. I seriously hope it was just a trick of the light, my mind twisting the forms and shadows of the branches and trees in front of me. Then again, there's no mistaking that howl. I truly believe that there is a werewolf, or something very much like it, lurking in the Black Forest. The Icy Hand. From Pumpkin Mama, 2022. This story happened a few weeks back. I went on a cruise for the very first time with my family. I didn't really care for the idea. The ocean and how vast it is have always creeped me out, and being out there in the dark night with nothing but miles of water in every direction was not very appealing to me. But my family dragged me along anyway. Most of the cruise traveled over the North Atlantic, and it was indeed beautiful. But for me, I was still unsettled. For the first few days, everything was great. We enjoyed delicious food, played in the pool, saw a show or two. It really was kind of magical, and even I was beginning to get settled in and more comfortable as time went on. But on the fourth night, as we all said our goodnights and got ready for bed, I had an eerie feeling that I just could not shake. I tucked in my 2 daughters and went to bed myself at around 11 at night. The rest of the ship was silent. In fact, I sort of assumed I was the only one still awake, or at least one of the few. I lay down in my bed and tried to get some sleep, not bothering to turn on the TV, as I didn't want to wake up my boyfriend, who was already fast asleep. I must have managed to doze off, because I woke up with a start not long after to one of those dreams where you feel like you're falling. Groggy as I wasn't very aware of my surroundings, which is why the voices didn't strike me as red flags. I assumed that the screaming and crying I was hearing were coming from the TV and that my boyfriend had turned it on. It was quite loud, and I was afraid it would wake up or frighten my daughters, so I sleepily said, "Babe, can you turn that down, please?" No answer, and the sounds continued, seeming only to get louder. I groaned in frustration and turned over. "You're gonna wake the girls. Turn it." I froze. The TV was off, and my boyfriend was asleep. The sounds stopped abruptly as I turned over, and I lay there straining my ears for some time. Nothing. Just silence in the dark room. At this point, I rationalized I must have dreamt the whole thing. It didn't take me long to fall back to sleep after that, mostly because I had not exactly been wide awake to begin with. So the night wore on. I slept well for a while, but when I next woke up, I saw that the clock on my nightstand read 2:18 a.m. I remember that specific detail vividly for some reason. I lay there for a couple of minutes before I thought I heard the bedroom door open. I didn't turn to look, as I assumed it was one of my daughters coming to cuddle. I taught them that they were always welcome to come get in bed with me if they were scared or felt unwell. They didn't even have to wake me first. I felt a weight press down on the bed beside me and scoot closer. "Hi, sweetie," I whispered in greeting. No response, but I could hear soft rustling of blankets behind me. Suddenly, against my back, I felt an absolutely ice-cold hand touch me. It was so cold, it shocked me into a gasp. "Oh my goodness, you're freezing. What have you been doing?" I whispered, glancing over my shoulder, although all I could make out was a slowly breathing lump under the covers. It didn't register at the time, but thinking back on it now, the figure in bed with me was too big to be either of my toddlers. I still received no answer, but as the icy cold figure pressed close to my back, even laying an arm on me, I grabbed the thick comforter that I'd tossed aside on the bed and draped it back over both the figure and myself. "There you go. Go to sleep. Mama's tired," I muttered. The only response I got was a deep, satisfied sigh and then silence. I fell asleep soon after. The next morning, I was once again alone in my bed. Nothing but a slight impression in the mattress and wrinkled sheets remained beside me. I got up and met my family in the little kitchenette of our room. They were making breakfast. My daughters ran over to greet me, and I crouched down to hug them. "Which one of you girls came to sleep with me last night?" I asked. The two children continued to giggle and casually replied, "I didn't, Mommy," in unison. This surprised me, and I glanced at my boyfriend. "Then it must have been you trying to sneak some cuddles, huh?" I asked with a smirk. Sipping his coffee, he shook his head. "No, babe, wasn't me." At that, my smile faltered. My boyfriend asked me what was wrong, and I told him and the rest of my family what I'd experienced that night. Nobody even owned up to having left their rooms during the night. Creeped out, I went to stand on the balcony of our room, glancing out over the ocean. As I watched the water, something suddenly dawned on me. I remembered where we were, and I quickly found our location using Google on my phone, roughly calculating in my mind approximately where we would have been at around 2:20 this morning. I told my boyfriend what I discovered, and he looked confused. "So, what does it matter where we were last night?" he asked. "Honey, look," I said, handing him my phone with a set of coordinates on screen and a description. I saw his face go pale as he put the pieces together in his mind. Last night at around 2:20 in the morning, we would have been right over, or at least very close, to the wreckage of the Titanic. My boyfriend and I never told anyone else about the discovery. After all, who would believe something like that? But I know it happened. I've experienced paranormal happenings all my life, and normally would have chalked it up to the norm for me. But I could not ignore the coincidence of being right there, right then, feeling that icy cold hand. Haunted Military Home. From Nunya Business. This isn't my story, but my dad's. I'll refer to him as D for short. When D was in the military, he lived in a military home on a really old base where a lot of soldiers died in World War I. He was there for a short amount of time with two other soldiers. One night, he and his roommates decided to go out to eat. Their landlord was very strict about turning all the lights off before you leave the house, so as to not raise the electricity bill. So D and his roommates turned all the lights off and headed out. After going out for some time, they came back to see all the lights were on, and the faucet was even running. D thought it was weird, but nothing more than that. The landlord, though, would not be happy if he found out. The next time anything weird happened was when he was cooking dinner for himself. He bent down at one point to grab a pan from the lower cabinet, but when he came back up, he hit his head on the upper cabinet, hard, to the point where he touched his head and he saw blood on his hand. He looked around to see all the upper cabinets open, and none of them had been opened before. Again, he tried to brush it off. Sometimes when he would hang out with his friends late at night, they would hear a toddler giggling and running in the hallway, in that thumpy and clumsy way they do. The patter of feet would start at the end of the hallway and come towards them, but then suddenly stop. They expected to see a child emerge from the dark hallway, but it was only the noise. They couldn't explain it, but it scared a few guests too, who also heard it, and some would even refuse to come over anymore. The very last paranormal experience he had was actually while he was packing up his things to leave the military home. He was packing his things in a bedroom when his door slammed shut. He thought that it was the wind and got up to open it again, but when he pulled on the door, it wouldn't open. Have you ever been playing tag with a friend or a sibling when you were little, and they went into a room and shut the door before you could come in? And when you tried to pull the door open, it would open just a bit before the person on the other side mustered the strength to shut it again? This is what was happening with D. He would open the door just a little bit, try to peek through the crack and see who it was. But just before he could see it, it would slam shut again. And keep in mind, D was strong and fit in the military. That meant that what was holding the door shut was stronger than him. He tried tugging at it for a couple of minutes before stepping back and shouting, "This isn't funny," thinking it was one of his roommates who had come home early from doing something and now was messing with him. He tried to open the door after a second, and it opened, just as any door would. He looked out only to see an empty hallway, and when he looked out his window, his roommates were just pulling into the driveway. Paranormal encounters kind of run in the family. My grandpa once saw a red UFO in Minnesota that was also reported by thousands of others that very same night. My grandma claims to have seen Bigfoot, and there were other reports called in along with hers that night. I can only assume that I'm next. I'm a little scared for when the day comes, but hey, maybe I'll get to see Mothman. The Mines, from Edison F. This story takes place in Calico Ghost Town. One day, my family and I went on a vacation with a bunch of friends. I thought the trip was going to be fun, but I would turn out to be wrong. It started with me by myself in a mine that went about 200 yards deep. I'd gone very deep into it, to where I couldn't even see the outside light anymore. Nothing had happened just yet, not until I went out and grabbed a few friends that I had just met. There were about 6 of us total, and I'd been leading them through the mine that I thought I knew my way around. But I didn't, because we ended up going deeper than I had before. At one point, the mine opened into 3 veins. Off the left vein, it went down, I would say maybe 200 to 300 feet. To the right, it was straight and narrow to where you would probably have to start crawling. This was when it started to get scary, so I decided we should start making our way out. We were walking out, and I was in the back of the group. Before long, I began to hear footsteps behind me. I looked back about 5 times. Soon the steps became a fast walk, and eventually a sprint. I didn't tell the rest of the group, because I didn't want to sound like a wuss. Eventually, we made it out of the mine, and we made our way back to the campground. Later, around 1 to 2 a.m., me, my friend Brody, and a few other girls went to a cemetery that was right down the road. We made our way to it, and when we got there, the gate was locked. But I did find a way to get in, so we went inside. We then tried to speak to spirits. I didn't really believe in paranormal stuff. I just thought this idea would be fun. We sat down next to a grave and continued to try to speak to a spirit. I should note that my friend was wearing a cowboy hat. Because suddenly, I guess we made whatever it was mad that was there, as my friend's cowboy hat came flying right off. The thing is, there was no wind or breeze at all. We all got pretty creeped out then, so we went back to the trailers. We sat by a fire for a while, not really discussing what happened at all. We eventually went to bed, bidding each other goodnight and going our own ways. When I got back to my own trailer, I laid down on my bed and actually got teary-eyed thinking about what happened. I've had multiple experiences with what I believe to be ghosts now, but the worst I've ever had was when I was about 14. Me, my sister, and my mom flew out to South Carolina, where we would stay for about 6 days. We stayed at my aunt's house. They live around a highly forested area. We would go swimming out on their lake behind my aunt's place. That's where it happened. At one point, I got out of the water. I began to walk back to the house. I looked back for just a second. That's when I saw a big black figure. I ran straight into my cousin's room. I looked at his window, and by then, I didn't see it. So I just blew it off and went to bed. Honestly, I never did think I'd see something paranormal in my life. But I guess I was wrong. These experiences have stuck with me, and they'll probably stay with me forever. Hello everyone, Darkness here. You've come a long way so far, so why don't you sit back and relax for a moment? We still have quite a ways to go. If you enjoy what you're hearing, follow and rate Unexplained Encounters on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow me on X at Prevails. Now, this is a comment from my previous episode, 5 Most Disturbing Hunting Stories, from Andrew Eden 9405 on the Darkness Prevails YouTube channel. I really appreciated the Were-Coyote story. By the way, if you could somehow manage to rustle up some stories involving home invasions by some of these various critters, it would be fantastic from multiple different standpoints. Not necessarily all invasions per se, but at least encounters that involve people at home. Thank you. Werewolves are so yesterday, Were-Coyotes are the hip new thing. Yeah, I think that would be fantastic too. Some of the creepiest cryptid stories I've read involved the things coming up to people's doors and windows. I'll keep a lookout, and if you're listening and have a story about a strange creature near or even in your house, send it to me at darkstories.org. Now let's get back to the show. Bad Bike Memories from Serialeater. This happened to me the summer before my freshman year, just barely 14 years old, in a tiny town in Oregon. When I say tiny, I mean it. The town had maybe 1,000 residents, and scarcely a gas station. It was mid to late August, maybe a couple of weeks before the new school year, and like most boys my age, I was obsessed with my bike. I think Jim Hopper from Stranger Things describes it best. A bike like this is like a Cadillac to a kid. It was an old red thing I'd gotten for my 13th birthday, with a basket on the handlebars. It had a metal bit over the back wheel that could seat a second person if they sat right with their feet forward, as well as an old-fashioned clunky seat. The kind that sort of feels like it's biting your crotch if you sit too close to one end. I loved that bike. I checked its tire pressure after every ride, and added more air anytime it showed any sign of being a little low. I rinsed it with a washcloth in my driveway every weekend. I was constantly looking for any excuse to take it out for a ride, and consequently, I had become my family's errand boy. I'm the youngest of 4, but when this occurred, the older 2 of my siblings had already moved out, and my parents split up not long before I started middle school. So it was only my mother, my older sister, and me living there. This particular day, I'd gotten lucky. After I got home from the arcade, I was to take a bag of cans to the can return for some cash, and then my sister had asked me to snag her a snack at the gas station. After I'd finished my tasks, I was planning to collect blackberries. Anyone from the Pacific Northwest will tell you that they bloom rampantly in the summer, often on the roadsides, and are up for grabs to anyone who wants them. Then I rode my bike to the elementary school, as the gate was typically kept unlocked to the public, open to the playground there. I was looking forward to eating a baggie of gummy worms, maybe some blackberries too, and sit on a swing with a library book. Perhaps it was the red glow of the clocks inside the classrooms, the only thing visible through the windows of the pitch-black school, or the sun setting, sending the sky into a quickly darkening navy, hardly a morsel of orange or pink toward the horizon, which was especially odd during fire season. But I hadn't made it through more than a chapter of my book before a feeling of foreboding settled in my stomach. I remember repeatedly thinking to myself, you came here to read, so you're gonna read. Just one more chapter. And then when another chapter felt too long, just another page. It likely didn't help that if I wasn't listening to CDs of whatever new language I was learning at the time, it would have been French when this happened to me, I believe, I was usually listening to eerie, unexplained occurrences when I rode my bike. Not too different than this show. And at that time, I remember insisting that the story I was listening to was merely making me paranoid. Growing up, I was always told to trust my gut, and if I felt that something was wrong, I should listen to that. I quickly packed my things up into my bike's basket. It was 8:53 p.m. when I left, I remember glancing over my shoulder rather frantically at the feeling of being watched, and the classroom's clocks caught my eye. I sped out of that park like a bat out of heck. I felt stranger immediately leaving the school. Everything felt slow, as though something had knocked time out of place by an inch. Every car that passed me and my bike seemed to slow down as they drove by. Now, I won't go too into detail because it's not important, but I'd been a regular outpatient at the hospital, and I had an appointment 4 days after this for an EKG, some imaging, and I was to be discussing a new medication. So when my heart rate picked up dramatically, I began to feel wheezy. I thought of my mother reminding me to monitor my heart and breathing, and perhaps due to the confusion and fear, my mind was scrambled, and I hadn't connected this to the other odd happenings, though I now know that these were some of the first warning signs. Because I rode my bike so often, I had developed a mental map of paths, and I often took the same route home every day, one which followed the street lamps, so I could see more than the small weak light on the front of my bike allowed. However, as I rode through the park, lights began to flicker, some buzzing out entirely. The Shell sign on the gas station, which I had a view of out of my bedroom window and had never seen off, appeared to be shut down. When I rode past the library, a man walking a dog passed me, and I could have sworn that I saw the man stop and watch my bike pass, uttering one word: stop. But I didn't brake for anything. Though when I looked down, I could see my legs moving incredibly fast, and yet I didn't feel like I was moving very fast at all. As I turned onto my street, I first noticed there was a new mist in the air, soaking into the back of my t-shirt and my shorts. Or maybe I was simply sweating that much. I couldn't tell. Secondly, I noticed that the street appeared to be lined with stray cats. This itself wasn't very unusual. Our town was full of them, and I would often sit on the sidewalk petting 3 or 4 cats at the same time. But these cats were all sitting forward, staring at the street, and as soon as I passed the first one, all of them seemed to turn around, eyes boring into me intently, glowing subtly in the dark. I couldn't see past the top of the small hill I was riding up, but I knew that any cats on the other side were turned to watch me as well. I quelled an urge to shudder, but still I brushed it off. Cats are curious things after all. You pass one all the time and they would stare. That I could explain. More streetlights blinked as I passed by. Then, as I reached the bottom of the hill, something raced out of the woods, which also where I live is not too peculiar by itself. Deer cross the road whenever they please. Sometimes I'd see a pig, and chickens seem to go on walks with their families every day. But this animal, I don't even know what it was. It could have been almost human. It was bipedal, and vaguely it was human-shaped. But it was tall, too tall, at least 7 feet. Its arms hung down to its knees, and I couldn't tell if it was hunched over or not. Its skin was gray and lumpy. Every vein must have been poking out of its body. Its head didn't seem to be separate from its neck. It stopped on the sidewalk to my left. Slowly, almost creakily, it turned its eyes on me, where I'd skidded my bike to a stop in the center of the road for fear of hitting an animal and either killing it or being sent flying over my handlebars. I gasped, shaking, heart beating out of my chest. I was frozen for a moment with a gaping mouth. Its eyes glowed yellow. I couldn't see pupils, and had an almost snout-like nose, and its breathing sounded like floorboards groaning. I could see its chest rattle with every breath. It turned its head to the side, but its neck didn't seem to move with its head, despite looking to be the same appendage. As soon as my brain caught up and decided that this thing was likely hungry, I didn't feel like becoming its next meal. So I decided to press down on my pedals as fast and hard as I could go. I have never pedaled so fast in my life. I spared a look over my shoulder, and that creature was turned all the way around, watching me still. I remember thinking, crap, standing up on my bike. The further I rode from the animal, the faster I went. Remember when I said that it had earlier felt like time had been bumped out of place? Well, this was time reslotting itself. As soon as my house came into view, I turned, frantically riding into my garage. I didn't care to grab my book out of my bike's basket. I didn't care to check my bike's tires. I only ran to the garage door, desperately clicking the close button. Then, not bothering to even shoo the stray cat that had gotten into the garage out, I sprinted inside my house, fixing the lock. Being a latchkey kid for the better part of my childhood, unshockingly, I was alone in the house. I took a shower and tried to forget anything happened at all. But as I sat on the couch and ate a microwaved pot pie, probably watching Friends or some other sitcom on TV, I couldn't help but glance out the living room window, half expecting that creature to have its snout pressed against the glass. I tried very hard to avoid that spot for the rest of the summer, which wasn't easy, considering that it was the street I lived on, and every street in the town turned onto the same long main road out of town. There were 4 turns on my street, all of which led to that strip of road. But with the start of school, I could no longer avoid it. Or I could, but the alternative was passing a bully's house on the way home, a bully who commonly threw things at my best friend and I during physical education, and I'd rather not have a basketball chucked at my head while riding my bike. So I risked it. I wasn't going home very late. I'd made sure after the first incident. The latest I'd be home was around 5 to 6 o'clock, when I'd have after-school activities. The first few weeks were perfectly fine, save for some anxiety. But during late September one afternoon, I felt it again. That slow, strange, dreading feeling, as though I were moving through honey. Everyone I biked past seemed to stop and watch me go. And when I went down that hill, I ignored the presence I felt watching me in the nearby trees and just kept riding. As of writing this, I'll be a junior with the start of my next school year, and I'd say I'm much more mature now. Definitely taller, and I've even had to start shaving my face. But I can tell you right now, if I ever see that thing again, I'll never be so confident in turning tail on my bike and leaving immediately. 2 people were actually found mauled and dead on my birthday, and I can't help but wonder if that could have been me. I never stay out past sundown anymore. Squirrel Hunting from CryptidBilly. I used to live in the Deep South. It was a small town right where the mountains of Appalachia met the flatlands of Middle Georgia. While I was there, I met this older guy named Mr. Jones. He was your typical Southern Baptist deacon type. I mean that in a good way. He was a jovial, kind-hearted, honest, and hard-working man who had a big belly, a gray mustache, and rough hands to match. His kids were all grown up and gone, so it was just him and his wife, living alone in a small ranch-style house way back in the woods. They had quite a lot of property and couldn't really manage the upkeep on their own. They were in their early 80s at the time. Long story short, I needed some extra cash, and they needed help around their place. So I'd go out to Mr. Jones's place every so often to help him with chores and odd jobs. He didn't pay me much, but it usually wasn't hard work. $20 for cutting the grass, $10 for helping him clean the garage, $5 here or there for this or that. It was easy money. Besides, I liked Mr. Jones and his wife. They were good people, easy to talk to. Mr. Jones seemed to know how to do everything. He taught me how to change the oil in my car, some basic woodworking skills, how to install a sink faucet, and loads of other things. Basically, he would talk me through a project, and I would do the actual work, since he couldn't get around very well those days. One day we were at an old outbuilding on the edge of his property. It used to be a chicken house, but it had been converted into a storage shed. That was fairly common in the area, They're usually a few 100 feet long and are made of exposed wood and rusted tin. This particular one had holes rusted in the roof, and kudzu wrapping itself around a solid third of the structure. It was filled with decades of abandoned projects, bits of donor machinery, scraps of fence building equipment, an old MIG welding setup, and all kinds of stuff. The section we were working on that day was filled with cardboard boxes, bits of scrap metal, jars of rusty nails, and broken tools that Mr. Jones had hoped to make use of eventually. We were organizing it. By that I mean Mr. Jones told me where he wanted things to go, and I moved them around for him. I picked up one cardboard box that was a little wet on the bottom. I did say there were holes in the roof, and it split open, spilling its contents all over the ground. There were what looked to be some old tax documents, a couple of cassette tapes, 3 antique Coke bottles, an empty pill container, and a heavily weathered box of .22 caliber bullets. I apologized for spilling his stuff everywhere as I began to pick it up. I felt embarrassed by it for some reason, like I had violated his privacy by looking in the box, even if it wasn't on purpose. No, it's all right, boy. Accidents happen, he assured me. Say, hand me that box of bullets, will you? I did as he asked. He rubbed the box gently with his thumb and got a distant look in his eyes. Something the matter? I asked. Oh, no, nothing. This is just some leftover ammo from when I used to go squirrel hunting with the boys. But that was a long time ago. I was still gathering up everything I'd dropped. I asked Mr. Jones absent-mindedly. Haven't been squirrel hunting in a while, I take it. No, I had a bad experience the last time. Soured the sport for me. Now, I felt pretty close to Mr. Jones. He was sort of like a surrogate grandfather. So I teased him a little. What happened? Were you afraid the fluffy things wanted revenge? He was quiet for a little while. Long enough for it to get uncomfortable there in that old rusty shack. No, it was something else. Something strange. Hard to describe it, really. I felt guilty for my teasing now. I wanted to backpedal when Mr. Jones, stroking the edges of his bushy mustache, asked me, "Do you believe in ghosts, boy?" Mr. Jones had always seemed like a practical kind of guy. I almost laughed at his question. It took me off guard. Instead, I simply said, no. A shame, really. You wouldn't believe me if I told you then. I had neatly piled the box's contents onto a workbench at this point. I turned and asked him to tell me anyway. He was quiet for a long time, with a thoughtful look on his brow. But just before I got comfortable again, he slowly started his story. I think it must have been about 48. My, it still seems so fresh. But it's been a lifetime. Me and some of my pals had gone squirrel hunting near Gainesville. It wasn't nearly as developed back then. I think there's a mall there now where this patch of woods was. It was good hunting. We had spent all day out there, bagging a few squirrels each. Money was tight back then. It was before I got work at the factory. Anyway, we were headed back to Lance's truck. He had parked not far off the dirt road that led out that way in a clearing. As we came over the hill, we saw a young black boy standing near the truck. He was looking into the truck bed. Lance called out to him, saying hello and asking if there was a problem. But he didn't answer. He just stood there. As we got closer, I got this turning feeling in my guts. Reminded me of the war, to be honest. It was like something was really wrong. That was when I got a good look at this kid. His clothes were dirty and torn up, like he'd been in a heck of a fight. He was wearing an old-style suit, too, striped and tan, and he had a brimmed hat to match. Lance shouted at him again. This time the boy turned towards me, and I saw he had no face. He looked right at me. Where his mouth, nose, and eyes should have been, it was just blank. And then just like that, he was gone. Lance ran over to his truck. The other fellas followed after him. They looked everywhere, but couldn't find a trace. I don't know where he could have gone, but he was gone, vanished, just like that. Mr. Jones punctuated this with a snap. Now I was the quiet one, digesting what he'd just told me. Mr. Jones said solemnly, "Never did go squirrel hunting again after that. Meat is stringy anyway." He tossed the bullet box under the workbench. I told Mr. Jones the truth when I said I don't believe in ghosts, but I doubt he feels the same way. Jenna's story, from Daymon S. A girlfriend of mine whom I was dating for several years back in the early 2000s told me about this bizarre occurrence. To better understand the reason that I wholeheartedly believe the details of the story as she remembered it, and to emphasize the fact that there is virtually no possibility of a logical explanation of what occurred, I need to explain a bit about my ex-girlfriend. She was 20 years old at the time. I was 22. I'm now 47 as of 2024. My girlfriend's name was Jenna. She was extremely sweet and a little naive, endearingly so. Now, some facts about Jenna and her character are that Jenna has never experienced or been diagnosed with any mental illness, never suffered from any hallucinations, before or after the events of the story. On the rare occasions that she attempted to lie or to exaggerate a story, it was always obvious, and she was a very bad liar. I knew Jenna well enough at the time that I was able to determine if she was even slightly embellishing something for dramatic effect. She really didn't have a duplicitous bone in her body. I've shared this story, she told me, with later girlfriends, acquaintances, my friends, and family, and also while donating a small portion of my precious time on Earth during a short stint in prison. I would recount this to a small group of my fellow inmates, gathering around my bunk in the evening. They all got the chills, and many were completely freaked out, knowing that I was not bullcrapping them. As best I can recall the incident, just as it was told to me, while making a conscious attempt to not exaggerate the details. It was the early 2000s, and I was living in Central California, in the San Joaquin Valley, which is near Bakersfield. Specifically, I grew up in a town between Fresno and Bakersfield. Jenna and I were dating, and by the time she had relayed the story to me, we had been together for quite a while. I was well acquainted with her idiosyncrasies and her inability to lie or stretch the truth convincingly. On the day this took place, Jenna was driving to her aunt and female cousin's apartment in town. I think she was just going to visit the cousin, who was approximately the same age as Jenna, and the two were quite close, having grown up together. In this apartment, her aunt and her female cousin, whose name was Stacy, lived there alone. Stacy's father had been out of the picture, apparently, for quite a long time. Sadly, a common scenario. Jenna's closeness with her family afforded her pretty much unrestricted access to all her immediate family's homes and apartments. She also had spare keys for most of them. She was welcome to come and go, for the most part, as she pleased. This also included unannounced visits. I honestly can't remember specifically if we had cell phones back then for normal use, being what we would refer to as poor white trash, and I mean that by financially disadvantaged, not from the shallow gene pool aspect. Anyhow, the point was Jenna would not have to call Stacy to announce her visit. She just came with no advance notice, driving right up to their apartment that afternoon. The apartment complex was 2 floors with a dirt patch in the front near the street that could be parked on. But the tenants' parking was in the rear of the building, with all the front doors facing the street. These apartments had one entrance and no access out the back. There was one large window in the front of each apartment, with none in the back or sides. This complex was not in the best of places, but her aunt and Stacy both had rooms of their own. Jenna parked at the front, with no reason to believe that her family members weren't home, even though she couldn't see them from where she parked. So she did as she normally did, heading upstairs one flight, walking 3 apartments down the open breezeway to her aunt and cousin's door. She tried the doorknob, and finding it locked, used her key to open the door without knocking. She stepped inside. She didn't see her aunt or cousin right away, so she walked from the front door to her left and looked inside the small kitchen area. No one was there either. So she called out, "Hey guys, it's me." Getting no reply, Jenna then began walking down the short hallway, which led to the 2 bedrooms in the back of the small apartment. The first room was to her right. It was her aunt's room. She glanced in there but saw no one. She called out again, "Hey Stace, it's Jen." After this also failed to receive a response, Jenna headed further down the hallway. When she told me this story, Jenna recalled that she was fairly convinced that no one was home by that point. After all, it would be nearly impossible not to have heard her. From her vantage point in the hallway, the one bathroom at the end was vacant, and most of the lights in the place were turned off, all save for Stacy's room. It had a single light, faintly illuminating the hallway. Jenna then walked a few steps towards her cousin's doorway, then turned to look inside. To her left were her cousin's dresser drawers. Directly in front of her was her cousin Stacy's bed, and there was Stacy sitting on it. She was upright, but completely motionless, just sitting there at the edge of the small mattress, facing away from Jenna. Jenna was surprised. She assumed that if there really was nothing wrong, her cousin would have replied earlier when she had announced herself. So she spoke. "Hey, Stace, what's up, girl? Are you okay?" Her cousin, still sitting on the mattress's edge, made no movement in response that would indicate she was aware that Jenna had said anything to her, or even aware of Jenna's presence at the doorway to her room. Now becoming increasingly concerned about her cousin, Jenna began moving further into the room near the bed. She was confused by Stacy's strange behavior and imagined all the worst-case scenarios spinning in her mind that could explain Stacy's rigid, unmoving posture. At that moment, as she neared the end of Stacy's bed, her aunt's voice came from the living room area, as well as the familiar sounds of the front door opening and what was most likely someone with arms full of grocery bags shuffling into the kitchen. But then there was a second voice. Her aunt was talking to someone cheerfully. She recognized that second voice immediately. It was Stacy, whose bed she was now facing away from. As she listened to the commotion in the kitchen, Jenna was now in a semi-state of shock and confusion. She was trying hard to rationalize and make sense of all the contradicting sensory input. Finding her voice, Jenna softly called down the hallway. Auntie, it's Jen. I just stopped by to, She paused mid-sentence, trailing off. A cold dread washed over her as she slowly turned back toward Stacy's room. To her horror, the figure on the bed had turned its head, but in this unnatural way, without moving its shoulders or lower body at all. What should have been there, the familiar face of her cousin, was gone, replaced by a grotesque visage that stared back at her. Skin gray like campfire ash, sharp angles where there should have been curves, with an emotionless gaze and a mouth with no discernible lips or expression. Its black eyes were deep-set in dark pits and devoid of life, not angry but slightly squinting, reflecting the image of herself in them as she stood there in front of it. Jenna screamed then, the sound ripping through the little apartment as she bolted down the hallway, bursting into the kitchen where her aunt and Stacy were unpacking groceries. "There's someone in Stacy's room!" Her words tumbled out in a frantic jumble. Her aunt and cousin looked at each other and then back at Jenna. "What are you talking about, Jenna?" Stacy asked, likely confused that her cousin had just emerged from the back of their apartment. "We only just got back a minute ago." Jenna grabbed her cousin's arm frantically. "No, there's another Stacy. She's not right. She's in your room." The three cautiously returned to Stacy's room. Jenna, still shaking, hesitated to even look inside. But the room was now empty. A chill ran down Jenna's spine. The demon-like entity that defied logical description, so horrifying that her mind felt unhinged as it struggled to process it, was now gone. But she knew what she had seen. It wasn't a hallucination, not a trick of the light. It was something else entirely, something evil that had worn her cousin's face like a mask. The only sign of recent occupancy of the bed was the faint indentation on the mattress where the thing had been sitting. Jenna's aunt and cousin searched the apartment, their voices hushed in the sudden silence. But there was no trace of her cousin's doppelganger, no back windows to escape through, no hidden doors or exits, no access panels, service hatches, or attic space. No possible explanation for its sudden disappearance. She never went to her aunt and cousin's apartment after this. I can't recall her telling me if they, her aunt and Stacy, even stayed much longer there after that. I believe the events of that day left a scar on Jenna's soul, a terrifying reminder that the world held mysteries darker than she had ever imagined. She never could quite shake the feeling she had glimpsed something truly evil, a creature that could mimic human form, but possessed a dark energy as cold and empty as the void. Thank you for tuning in to Unexplained Encounters. If you're not already, follow and listen to Unexplained Encounters on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Leave us a rating while you're at it. Get some cool creepy merch at eeriecast.store. Check out my other show where I narrate scary work stories. It's called Tales from the Break Room. For more terrifyingly entertaining shows from EerieCast, go to eeriecast.com. And if you want to listen to Unexplained Encounters and all the other EerieCast shows without pesky ads, sign up for EerieCast Plus at eeriecast.com/plus. You'll also get exclusive access to horror audiobooks only available to EerieCast Plus members. And you'll get 20% off our EerieCast.store merch through our members-only monthly discount code. Finally, if you have a scary story of the unexplained, send it to me at darkstories.org. I think that's about it. Thank you so much for joining us. Stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.